Good morning, race fans, and welcome to the front stretch, presented by Joe's Karting at Council Bluffs, online at joeskarting.com. That is karting with a K. Get to Joe's today. Fast-paced, white-knuckle racing, where the only speed restriction is how fast you are.
And you're not.
And every weekend, you got to remind people. Anyways, this is the front stretch.
You make the speed of smell look good.
It does look good. Anyways, get to Joe's today, joeskarting.com. It's karting with a K. And the only place you can get to where there's indoor karting, which this time of year, I'm really glad you guys are indoors.
Yeah, we're staying pretty darn busy right now. I've had a lot of folks tonight asking me if we're doing really good, and we are actually. We got a new campaign coming out on Facebook here in the next week or two. Be giving away a lot of races, a lot of specials. So go on to Facebook, look up Joe's Karting. You can look me up under Buddy Ray Jones or Holiday Horsepower Drive. A lot of times I'll share a lot of the same things that I'm doing at work on my Facebook. As as Dan says, I'm kind of like a Brad Keselowski of Facebook when it comes to doing stuff. So look us up there. So.
All right, and you can hear it in the background. There's a little bit of noise going on. We are recording a special show tonight at Quaker Steak and Lube. We're doing it live, like they do on the Tonight Show, and it's like live. It's edited down for FCC purposes, depending on how crazy it gets tonight. I've heard stories about this Bill Rick guy. Apparently, I'm going to need to edit him down quite a bit. I've got the bleep button ready to go.
And that whole table there.
Yeah. You heard him. He's the sweet, sultry sound of Stan Caesar. We're doing a special show. It's called A Walk Down Sunset Lane. By the way, folks, if you haven't yet, we had some special little posters made up there of a couple of the drivers, a little bit of tribute for tonight's show. There's only 100 of them, so if you want to grab some, go ahead and grab them. But let's get started with the show and just figure out exactly how all of this got started. We're joined by Stan Caesar, the voice of Sunset Speedway. And Stan, you got a book of information here in front of you.
Well, yeah, they're about midway through the 44 years of Sunset Speedway. They put a book together, and it had a lot of great information. And I've been kind of looking at picking out a few notes through there, and just some particular stats and stuff like that, just in case I would happen to forget something, which I don't think I will, though.
I don't think so either. You're the encyclopedia when it comes to dirt racing, and I've been told you're the encyclopedia when it comes to Sunset Speedway. Wanted to have you on for the start of the show because I don't think there's very few people that are more appropriate when it comes to Sunset Speedway, but let's talk about the beginning. Tell me how it got started. Who founded this whole thing? Whose crazy idea was it to put a racetrack out in West Omaha?
Well, basically, there was a lot of racing going on in the area. They raced out at Arlington. They raced at the old Grandview Speed Bowl down in Bellevue. Of course, Playland Park Speedway was dirt before it turned into asphalt later on. And one of the guys that competed over there was Albert Hayden. And he owned a race car and had different guys driving it at one time or the other. And the Hayden family owned some land out near Irvington, and his brother August was a farmer out there, and Albert was the motorhead of the brothers. And he and August got together, and Albert basically talked August into building a racetrack out on some of his property out there. And it was kind of an ongoing deal for about a year. You know, they didn't have the sophisticated dirt moving equipment maybe back in those days that they have now, but I can remember going out there every Saturday afternoon. My dad was he was going to be the first flagman when they opened the door in 1957, and of course he was good friends with Albert and most of the guys that were out there helping build the track, and we would go out there just about every Saturday and see how things are coming, and remember seeing it take shape from basically just farmland into kind of a finished primitive oval, and then pretty soon some guardrail and then grandstands, and pretty soon they were having their first race on a Sunday afternoon back in 1957.
About how long did it take them to put this whole thing together? Was it one of these things? I mean, today when they build stuff like this, it seems to take forever, regardless if they're just moving little bits and pieces.
I think it was ongoing, probably I would say at least a year in the making. It started one year, and then of course they had winter. They did get some preliminary work done, and they did all the finished work the following spring. And I do remember one deal. They had a guy testing a car out there one day, and this was before guardrail, before grandstands, anything. Just making a few test laps around the track, and managed to roll the car end over end on a Saturday afternoon.
Was Were you racing then, bud?
No, I wasn't racing back then. Nope, not quite.
It was not. No, we'll squash that. We'll squash that rumor. It was not Buddy Ray Jones.
That first season when they were practicing on that track and testing it out, what was the turnout like?
Well, I mean, it was basically informal. It wasn't a formal practice session or anything like that. It was just a guy happened to bring a car out. He was buddies with Al Hayden and said, hey, can I bring the car out and try it out? And he brought it out. Track wasn't prepped. It was dusty, et cetera, but it managed to find its way off of all four wheels before the day was over.
Talk to me about racing in those days. Was there several tracks around the area? Was this the first of its kind in this area? Was there...
Oh, not really. There was, like I said, the guys used to race out at Arlington, out at the fairgrounds. They had a track out there. Bill can probably talk about that a little bit more. I know they raced at Playland on Friday evenings over there. They raced at the Grandview Speedway, and I know Glenn was probably down at Grandview. There was a track over on the old South Omaha Bridge Road called Riverside or the Blue Heron. They had racing going on over there. A lot of guys would travel. Some would go to Sioux City. I mean, there was racing down in Lincoln, Nebraska, and the guys that were they'd hit the ground running that were pretty already established, had been racing for quite a number of years, you know.
Yeah. And then, so 1957, the very first green flag is thrown at Sunset Speedway. Your dad was the flagman.
Right. He was the flagman out there for, I believe, the first 9 years of racing out at Sunset. And actually, that first heat race, I think it lasted all of to turn one before one car ended up on top of another car, and a guy by the name of Bob McKee and Al Constantino, and they had an incident in turn one so it went about a half a lap before the first caution flag flew.
Is there anybody in the crowd that happened to be at that first race? Anybody at all? All right, there we go.
Well, obviously, there's at least one,
yeah.
and yeah.
There's a few of you, but I guess any fans that were at that first race? Make sure in turn 4 you come up and ask us some questions. We want to hear from you guys.
Speaking of the guy that was here that first race, he managed to win the A feature that afternoon. That was, of course, Glenn Roby.
Glenn's going to be joining us here in just a little bit. We'll have him on the show, and in turn 2, we'll talk to him about that first win in the first few years at Sunset Speedway. What were the crowd counts like those first couple of years? There wasn't. What was the crowd count like at that time?
Well, the grandstand obviously wasn't as big as it was later on, but packed wall to wall, one end to the other. I'm thinking, before and into the early 60s, they were doing 3,000-4,000 people every Sunday night out there.
Wow.
It was the only place to be on Sunday night, and even back in the early days, the people packed it out, and they put on a great show out there, and it was a neat deal.
Why Sunday night? Why not Saturday night or Friday night?
Well, possibly. I know Playland, I believe, raced every Friday night back in those days, and on Saturday night, I think maybe Arlington maybe raced on Saturday nights, and different. That was the open night, and I think I wasn't as familiar with racing at the other tracks other than Playland. I knew Playland was Friday night, and I knew that when they opened Sunset, it was on Sunday nights, of course.
All right. What else can we talk about that first the opening of the track?
Well, that first year, and the drivers came from all facets of racing. Some guys had been ex-motorcycle racers. Some guys had started in cars, the old jalopies, in which they kind of transformed into the more sophisticated, smaller coupe cars, and the guys were racing back in those days. Quite a number of guys also raced in the midgets back, and those guys, as I said, hit the ground running. There were guys like Bobby Parker, he was a longtime midget racer, and before he set foot in a stock car. And then most of these guys started out racing back in stock cars somewhere, whether it be Grandview or Playland or something. And then as soon as Al built the track out there along with August back in '57, they migrated out to Irvington, Nebraska.
That kind of leads the question I was thinking of was, what did they race? Was there 5 classes out there? Was there 4 different classes? Was it just one class? Was it what?
One class of cars.
Yeah.
And every week there would be 3 to 4 heat races, usually a speed dash, a trophy dash, a CB, and an A feature. And that was basically plenty of racing.
Huh.
You know, the multiple classes came in later on during the Klein Brotherson era, and then into the Kelly era that came in later on. But back in the early days, it was one class, and that was the modified coupes.
What time was green flag usually?
I'm going to say 6:30 or so every Sunday night.
Plenty of time to get back home from church, get some stuff done, a little bit of dinner in you, and then get out to the track.
And time to get home.
Yeah.
You know, everybody talk about racing on Sunday nights and having to work on Monday mornings. Well, I can tell you from experience, most of the guys that visited the Sunset Inn after the races and that were out there, they weren't worried about they hung for as long as there was, you know, something to do until they kicked them out of the place. So.
Talk about the Sunset Inn. What is that?
Well, the Sunset Inn, that came just a little bit later on, and it was basically back in the early days, everybody, after the races were over, everybody ventured on the way home. That was back, the roads were different. You drove up State Street, you know, went through Irvington, which was 90th Street, and there used to be a little place called the El Rancho Bar and Grill, and everybody was at the El Rancho after the races. They had great food, they had burgers, you know, and obviously, I was tagging along with my dad. I always made a stop there because that was always the place we would stop after the races and bench race with everybody. Well, later on, they built an actual restaurant and bar and lounge right on the Speedway grounds called the Sunset Inn. And that was the place to be, and it was later became the home of the famous Sunset Speedway broasted chicken.
I've heard so many stories about this broasted chicken. I wish another one of those things that I missed out because I'm a Johnny-come-lately when it comes to dirt tracking. All right, we're going to take a break, come back in turn 2. We're going to get joined by Bob Koziski, Bill Rick, Glenn Roby, and we're going to start telling some stories about winning races at Sunset Speedway. Welcome back to the Fred Stretch, presented by Joe's Karting in Council Bluffs, online at joeskarting.com. We are into turn number 2, brought to you by Koziski Auto Parts. KoziskiAutoParts.com, or you can even check them out on Facebook, Koziski Auto Parts, for all of the affordable repairs you need to do to your car. Get yourself a new radiator, maybe it's a new tie rod, maybe it's one of them Jimmy bars that a mechanic always finds you need to have replaced on your car. Koziski Auto Parts can track it down for you. 51st and I Street, Team PRP, Premium Recycled Parts. We're heading into turn number 2 of the first hour for the walk down Sunset Speedway. And this is the hour where the turn we're going to talk with Glenn Roby, Bill Rick, Bob Koziski, Stan Caesar, Keith Lightoff has joined us. We got so many guys joined up on this panel. We're just going to start asking questions. Stan, I'm going to kind of hand it over to you because you know these guys more than I do. So let's take it away, bud.
Well, I'll tell you what, you guys can hear me, and like I said, talk right into the microphone. Talk just a little bit about the competition back in the Coupe days. We talked about Bobby Parker, ex-midget driver. Although Glenn won those first 2A features out there in 1957, Bobby Parker picked up the first 2 years of points champions out there. Talk just a little bit about some of the drivers back out there in the early days. Who was pretty tough competition, and give us your thoughts. Start with Bill Rick, and then we'll just move right on down the line.
Well, Stan, I didn't start there.
Uh-huh.
I started up in Arlington, June 20th, 1954.
Uh-huh.
And so I was sitting in the grandstand when you run at Sunset. I'd seen Glenn win the race, and Bobby Parker, and you had Bud Aikenhead in there too. Don't forget Bud.
Yep.
And I didn't come down there to race until 1960, I think, 61. The first car that I come there with is on that sheet, and that's the one I win the point championship with, there and Council Bluffs, Playland. Mm-hmm. And so I can't tell much about the first few. Glenn can.
Back in the old days, you guys run the flathead Fords. You had a 32 Ford, and then we'll talk to Glenn. Glenn was just a little bit different. He didn't want to run those Fords. Glenn, talk just a little bit about your cars.
No, I had to have a Hudson.
Hudson.
You know. I was the only oddball. Well, there was a few Mopars out there too. You know, some of the guys was running Dodges and stuff, but that old Hudson seemed to like to ride the bumps out there when the track was a little rough, and it did real well for me.
And I think those Hudsons, didn't those Hudsons do pretty good on the NASCAR circuit? Maybe you had the unfair advantage, did your homework and found out that those guys running the Hudson Hornets down south were pretty fast.
Yeah, but they wouldn't let me use the Hornet.
Oh,
I had to stick with that 262 cubic inch. But anyway, no, the Hudson was really good to me. It really drove nice, and it did ride the bumps nice and everything. And maybe, at the time, did I have an advantage? I don't really know, but it worked out good for me.
Worked out pretty good for you.
It did.
And then, we'll move on down the line. Bob Koziski, basically, Bob didn't start, I think, out there those first couple of years. He was off racing on the IMCA late model circuit back in the early days. Bob, you started just a little bit later on out there.
No, I didn't start Sunset until about 61 or right in there. I run a few races in 61, but I think I run one race in 57. It was the last race of the year. Then I went overseas and I didn't come back, and I run that when I got back. I run IMCA until about 61, and then started running in Sunset races.
Running back out at Sunset, moving on down to the end of the line, Keith Lightoff. I know, Keith, you started out, didn't you start out as a car owner? You had Marvin Cruz driving?
Yeah, I started as a car owner. I had Jim Hazelton drove first year or so, and then Marv Cruz drove because I wasn't 21 yet.
Oh, you had to be 21 years of age back in those days.
Sign a release.
That cut out about half the field if they had that rule today.
But that was the fun days.
Uh-huh.
We had a lot
And you had Bill ran the 32 Ford, Glenn ran the Hudson. You had a 32 Chevy.
6, yeah.
And then
Bob
with
Cave.
Yeah.
Bob Cave and I.
Bob Cave had the 6-cylinder Chevy. Talk about a couple guys that aren't here. We already touched on Bobby Parker a little bit, ex-midget racer, and he came in, took those first 2 track championships. Then for the next 3 years, I know it was a guy from South Omaha that I knew that Bob knew, and I was pretty good friends with, Bud Burdick. He won 3 out of the next 4, and Bill Ricks shows up in 1961. I think you guys tied for the points championship that year. But let's talk just a little bit about Bud Burdick and what kind of competitor he was to race with through the years, Bill.
Bud was tough. Bud done a very good job of driving, and he had a fine car, and but he was fun to beat. Yeah. Because when you got all done, there was plenty of beer.
Oh yeah.
And we drank. We had our share after racing. Had great time. But don't forget, there was old Pete Huffman out there too, and Bob Adams. Well, they drove the Chryslers. And,
you start you start throwing some names out there. You mentioned Bud Aikenhead just a little bit earlier on the going. How about a guy from Bellevue, Jim Vanna? Jim Vanna, he was like a big mountain of a man, down there.
He was a very sturdy boy.
Yeah.
And I can remember him better at Playland Park. I didn't remember Jim going up at Sunset, but at Playland, Jim was there. But always kind of wonder with a lot of those people where they went.
Yeah, and you talk about some other guys. Glenn, how about the Stewart boys? Jim and John Stewart, you remember those guys? Merle Ravenstein?
You bet. Both of them guys was always right in there. And when you was talking about Big Jim Vanna, he was a moose. That guy, if that car wouldn't turn, he'd just break the steering wheel off. He was really a large guy. And one time I know he was having some kind of trouble, and he couldn't be there. He couldn't be there for the next week, so his owner asked me if I'd drive the car, and I was used to that Hudson. And I got in that thing, and I turned that steering wheel, and it actually squawked. And I said, my God, how do you drive this thing? And so anyway, there was a lot of good guys that was coming up through there there was so many of them from South Omaha and Council Bluffs and coming in from up north. I couldn't begin to tell you all the names, but we had a good group.
And you touched on Bob Cave just a little bit. I remember talked to Bob Koziski down there. Although Bob Cave never did pick up a points championship, he was always pretty tough, and he was running the 6-cylinder Chevys against the flathead V8s back in those days. Bob and Keith.
Go ahead.
Oh.
What about Bob?
Bob, talk just a little bit about Bob Cave and how tough he was. You could never count him out, the guys from Carter Lake.
Yeah, Bob Cave was a good competitor.
Yeah.
What, if I may ask, what made Bob difficult to? Was he tough to get around? Was he tough to get away from? What was his biggest quality when it came to racing?
Oh, I don't know, Bob. What do you think?
I don't know. He just always was there, just like everybody else. I mean, he just gave it all it was worth, and
I'd say
he
maybe
was a good racer.
The tenacity. You know, I mean, you might pass him, but he'd still race you till that checkered flag flew. You know, he was one that didn't give up, and you had to stay on top of your game, make sure you kept him behind you before the end of the race. Glenn?
I think with that combination between Bob Cave and Fred Helms was the one that kind of pretty much did the motors and the chassis on the thing, and Bob Cave did one heck of a nice job of driving it. You know, none of us had a whole lot of money, but they did do a good job, and I can honestly say that as long as Sunset Speedway was open from 1957 to 2000, for some reason or another, I could not win a championship. I just could not do it. I got close a couple of times, but I couldn't just seem to crack the nut.
Yeah, but it was in looking through the old Sunset Speedway storybook. We were close a number of times, coming right down to the last night. I know, but always one tough competitor. But you know something? I think, with the exception of Bill still doing some vintage racing, I think you were at it probably a little bit longer than the rest of the guys. So he who laughs last laughs the best. You know.
I don't know about that.
I'll tell you what, we didn't think Glenn was ever going to give up. We were trying to get him in the Hall of Fame, you know, and he had to be retired for a couple of years. But pretty soon they came out with a new rule, and he got in. Matter of fact, 3 of our guys sitting up here, also members of the Nebraska Auto Racing Hall of Fame. And let's move on to the next guy that isn't in attendance tonight. He's down in sunny Arizona someplace, Jim Wyman. Let's talk about some of the battles that went on, because you talk about the different cars and everything like that. Jim was another Ford guy, and even after they went to the overhead V8 engines, everybody was running small block Chevys. Jim was running the small block Ford, unlike the rest of you guys up here. Talk about Jim just a little bit.
Jim was a very good competitor. He could make that Ford Coupe run, and he could drive it. And when he passed you, he meant it. He kept going. When he got in the late models, it was a little bit different. His Fords wasn't quite as good as the Chevrolets, but he was a very good competitor.
Well, I tell you what, you talk about your rivalries that were going on, and this is back in the old days. Jim Wyman was always in the white car, you know. Bill Rick was always in the black car. Now, Wyman were in the white hat, Bill Rick were in the black hat. You had your good guys, and you had your bad. I would never ever use the term. Let's just say maybe over aggressive on occasion. Bill was the guy that he would race you hard from the time that green flag dropped. So in the grandstands, you had your fans that were Jim Wyman fans, and then the other half of the grandstand, you had your Bill Rick fans. And one was in black and one was in white. It was the good guy, bad guy deal. And I tell you what, that rivalry used to pack the people in there every Sunday night, right or wrong.
That is correct.
But off the track, you guys were good friends.
Very good friends. But it seemed like when you scratched somebody's paint, he'd bothered it. And I happened to scratch a little more than he did. But I enjoyed every lap of it. I really did.
Did you ever?
The lane is long at Sunset Speedway because it was a super place to be, super people, and I met a tremendous amount of good people.
Yep.
I still enjoy them.
You talk about you and Jim being friends outside of the racing. Was there ever an incident on the track that made it a little bit harder to go and talk to him afterwards, or were you always able to kind of just say, you know what, that was on the track and that's what happens?
You know, back in them days, we didn't carry a grudge.
No?
I didn't, and I never did. No, the only thing Jim didn't do he didn't drink as much beer as me and Bud Birdie. And Bob Kazicki was in there.
He was right in there too. Yeah. How about Keith down the end?
And you want to talk about something interesting? A man that could drink beer and then have a chocolate ice cream cone in his other hand, and that's Mr. Lido.
Is that true, Keith?
Chris, can we get him a
Oh,
chocolate ice cream cone?
There's something that I never forgot. Yes.
I tell you, and back in the old days, of course, you didn't go buy a chassis. Everybody built their own cars. Everybody had their own little tricks and everything like that. Now that we're not racing the coupes anymore, well, of course you are, Bill, but what are some of the things you guys might have did to the car to get the unfair advantage over? Now you can get it all out in the open. I know Keith, a great fabricator. Bob used to build his own cars with his brothers down South Omaha. Glenn built his own cars. And you guys talk a little bit about the behind-the-scenes guys that used to help you and maybe helped you with the setups and do the fabrication on those cars back in the day.
Well, okay, on mine, I was kind of a fumbler-along welder. On the farm, you did that. But I had a real good engine man. His name was Charlie Dornacker.
Yep.
And he could make it tuned up and run. And that was a helpful thing for me because I didn't know nothing about a motor. The only thing I knew was the steering wheel and the clutch and foot feet. And
Step on the gas, right?
and turn left. and just see how hard you could hit that corner without going upside down. That's one thing I never happened. I never got upside down.
That's a good thing.
I'd never bent the roof.
That's got you talk about Jim Wyman. I remember Jim Wyman one year upside down 3 times. And you talked about the appearance of the cars. Jim was one of these guys that took pride. That car was always spotless, 3 times he went over back in the old coupe days. You didn't just go buy new aluminum panels like you do nowadays. You had to do the body work. And the following week that car came back and it was looking like brand new again. And he's one that really took pride in doing a lot of body work and kept those cars good. Glenn, talk about your cars a little bit and who helped you on them back in the day.
Well, I did most all my own engines especially on the Hudsons and stuff. I took care of about everything on that. And I had 2 16-year-old boys on that first year of 1957 that actually owned the car. Dell Livermore's son and the kid that lived behind him. And I'd go up there to Dell's shop up in Blair, and that's where we'd work on it. Well, he had 2 Fords that he was working on too, and we had to wait our turn so we could even get inside the garage. And sometimes it was a little bit late when we got a chance to even get in there. But we seemed to get things done. And everything worked out all right.
Everything worked out. Yeah, I remember old Dell Livermore.
Oh, yeah.
And Bob, I know, of course, you had your dad helping you when you were doing the IMCA new car racing and that, and on the coupes and everything. Had the brothers down there.
I always had some pretty good help. I had my brother Tom. He helped me real good with the coupe, and my brother Dave and Dan, and they helped me good. And then when I drove the Dodge, I drove for Ernie Matz, and he was an awful good mechanic. Helped me pretty good on it. And
Yeah,
I tried all kinds of cars. I had Plymouth, I had Ford, Chevys. I tried them all. I think I liked the Chevy the best.
When you got down to Sunset on a regular basis, that was, like you said, back in maybe 1969, 70 or so. You were driving that Dodge for Ernie Matz.
Yeah, he was a good mechanic. He tried building everything on his own. Even if he had dual carburetors, he built his own manifolds and done everything with them.
And then moving on down to the end of the line, Keith, even going into the late model deal, Keith was one of the guys that prided himself, always build his own chassis. And if you looked at those cars, talk about an excellent fabricator and welder. He's sitting right down there on the end of the table. Keith Lidoff, those cars looked like they were the store-bought in piece, and they were all built by Keith, all by hand.
Well, I think the thing that we miss nowadays is everybody did their own engineering back in those days. And they learned a lot of valuable information, a lot of important, nice people, and we had a good time doing it, and we had some nice parties and so on with all of our friends afterwards.
You guys never partied after the races, did
Oh,
you?
no, not much. No. Bill remembers a party we had at
Bill
Mark
remembers
Cruise's.
that. He already
Bill, tell them about that party. These people probably don't know about that party.
He already spilled the beans that Keith wouldn't party unless he had ice cream to go along with the beer.
Yeah, ice cream and beer. Chocolate.
Chocolate.
You know what about the chocolate ice cream and the beer?
What is it that made it so special?
You never had an aftertaste in the morning, the next morning.
There you go.
Now you don't do that.
You learn something new every day, so everybody take that home with you tonight.
I got a feeling since
If you're going to the bar, stop for ice cream on the way home.
Hey, Chris, do you have any chocolate ice cream? These people are going to need some. You got any chocolate ice cream in the back? Okay,
Yeah.
Chris has got some. He'll put it on the menu for
Glenn's
you.
got something to add to that.
Well, I got to guarantee that what he's telling the truth because they was up at my place one night and I didn't have no chocolate ice cream, and so he wasn't going to do nothing about drinking beer unless he had some chocolate ice cream. I went to the store.
So you thought maybe you start talking with him a little bit and got a
Then he
few
started
beers in
talking
him.
to me.
Yeah, then he'd start talking to you. Maybe let out some speed secrets or something. Maybe you didn't pick up on. You know.
How tight was information that day? When you guys found something that worked, did you share it or kind of work with everybody else, or did you keep it locked up for your own information?
Well, it depends on whether it was a friend or a foe.
So you mean it depends on if he beat you the week before?
Well, I got one thing to say.
Oh.
You know, when 1957, when Sunset first opened, Bill and I parked right next to one another. And naturally, we rubbed a little bit from time to time. And then we got in the, when we parked, then we had to talk about things. But everything was all right.
Did you park next to each other on purpose because you guys were going to be rubbing during the race? You figured
Who would I ever hit on purpose?
it was never your fault.
Yeah, you always have people backing into you on occasion. So.
Let's take a break. We'll regroup here a little bit, and we'll come back and continue talking with three of the biggest legends at Sunset Speedway. Welcome back to it. We are heading into turn number 3 here on the front stretch, brought to you by the official watering hole of the front stretch, Quaker Steak and Lube. You know, I know we're talking dirt tracking, so please try not to boo me too much right now, but the Daytona 500 is just, it's just a few weeks away. And they changed up a lot of the rules in the off seasons for NASCAR, so it'll be an interesting Daytona 500. You can catch all the action on the big screens here at Quaker Steak and Lube. And next weekend, they're going to have the Super Bowl. The Denver Broncos and Seattle Seahawks are going to be going on. They've got some fantastic specials. I don't want to quote them because I'm probably going to get them wrong, but Lube Tube and wings, half a bucket of wings and a lube tube for $24.99. You can get a full bucket of wings and a lube tube for $35.99.
And then what do you get? One of those each quarter?
If you're a guy like me, yeah. And then you end up on the floor by quarter number 2. Quaker Steak and Lube, the official watering hole of the front stretch. And we appreciate all the support that Chris and everyone shows here at the front stretch. So let's get into turn number 3. My compadre for the night, Stan Caesar. Appreciate it, Stan.
Hey, thanks, Dan. And up here at the front table, we talked earlier about Bob Parker. Of course, Bob was the point champion at Sunset Speedway the first 2 years. And joining us now, his son, Dennis Parker. Dennis, former racer himself, raced back at Sunset for a few years. Back when I was racing, we competed. He had an old Mike DeZona coupe. I had a Chevelle, and we turned a few laps out there together. He moved on to sprint cars for quite a number of years. Dennis, talk just a little bit about growing up in racing. You know, I grew up around racing all my life, you know, going to tracks with my dad for quite a number of years, and then once it sticks, it's just like seems like you keep going. Of course, your dad raced for a number of years, raced the midgets, hit the ground running at Sunset Speedway when they started driving for Don and Ed Mercek back with the Oakums. Talk just a little bit about the early days as you were growing up around the racetrack with your dad going to races.
Well, that's about all we did.
A little closer.
That's about all we did.
And your dad, most of the time, he was always pretty much driving for a different car owner. You guys never really have his own car. He drove the midgets for Les Vaughn, I know, and those guys in Otto Raymer for quite a number of years.
Yeah, he drove a lot for a lot of different people. He did it for a living for I don't know how many years until he ended up having 4 kids.
Yeah. Raced the midgets, raced in the coupes, progressed up into the super modifieds, into the sprint cars. Raced over Knoxville Raceway. I remember seeing him at 68 over there, you know.
Yeah, he raced at Knoxville. He came back to Sunset in the early 70s and did about 3 years in late models.
In the late models. And you know, back in the old days, this is something we didn't touch on back in turn 2. Back in the old days when they raced those coupes, one of the staples of Sunset Speedway was the powder puff races. And we talk about powder puffs, and I see some folks here that might have been out there a time or two in the powder puffs. I see Joyce Rick, your wife, out there. She turned a couple laps out there in a car, did pretty good, right, Bill?
Right.
Who was the better driver between you two? I'm gonna put you on the spot. They're all pointing at Joyce.
Pointing at Joyce. But don't forget Flavia Roby.
Flavia Roby spent a lot of time in the powder puffs. I don't know. I think Grace might even drove on occasion in the powder puffs.
Stan?
Yes.
We can't forget Mrs. DeZona.
And DeZona used to compete quite a bit. Donna Parker, I know Bob Parker's wife. That's Dennis's mom. Did she ever talk about racing in the powder puffs? And you were raced in the powder puffs too? Cool. And then there was a gal by the name of Mary Ayers. If you remember her back in the days, she won quite a few powder puff derby races back in her day.
She was from West Point.
Huh?
She was from West Point.
Yeah, a ringer? She used to drive Johnny Stewart's car. Was she a ringer? She maybe was a little too good for the rest of the gals?
She might have been. I ain't going to say.
Of course, nowadays, I mean, you don't have powder puff derbies because the women just get right out there and bump heads with the men.
Yes, they do.
Yes, they do. And some of them do a pretty good job, don't they?
Yes, they do.
Don't forget Donna Lightoff was out there, too.
Yeah, Donna Light, of course. Like I said, back in the old days, and that was something everybody used to look forward to. At the end of the year, they'd always have a mechanics race, and the mechanics would jump back behind the wheel, and usually that ended up with the mechanics having to fix the cars that they wrecked after those deals.
Stan, you're talking about the powder puffs. Was there ever a weekly female racer?
Not till many years later.
When was? Because you talk about it now. You know, with Danica Patrick and all the women that are now that are starting to get into racing. We've seen women in racing for years and years and years. Do you remember the first time we had a female racer at Sunset?
First female racer, it came just a little bit later on, and it was in the Pro-Am division. It was a gal by the name of Tammy DeMott, and raced a car and raced weekly every week, and was a mid-pack driver, but she was out there every week and did a good job. And like I say, nowadays there's quite a number of really good female drivers, a lot of them that are still racing, like at I-80 Speedway or Eagle Raceway, that are right at the top of their game and win quite a number of features every year.
I think there's still some female Kaziskis racing.
Yeah, and there might have been a few of those females that might have beat Buddy Ray a time or two.
He said that he didn't count when he went and raced at Sunset as a female racer.
It's not that I let them beat me. I just want to be a good sport and let them feel good about their racing career, you know.
He was being a gentleman. One of the few times.
Wayne, talk about some of your memories of Sunset back in the early years.
My first memory.
Oh, yeah? I think I remember that.
Repeat that.
Flavia Roby did get a car upside down. I remember that night, yeah. Fell on her head, right.
Yeah.
Wayne?
No, I remember first time I went to Sunset was 1957, 12 years old, and the grandstands on the east side were all filled up, but at that time when the track first opened, I think maybe the first 3 years, they had grandstands on the west side of the track.
That's right, on the west side of the Speedway, and that's when the pits were off down on the south end, and I can remember every intermission, all the folks from the grandstand on the backstretch would walk across the infield of the concession stands.
Because no beer, no restroom
right,
over there.
And then they'd have to turn around and walk back.
Wait. You know, just in that section, there was still beer at Sunset, right? Or was it a dry track?
There was no beer on the backstretch.
Okay.
Or restroom.
Had me worried.
Or tree.
All right, sorry. Continue, gentlemen.
Well, that might have been farther on down the hill, but that was later on. So we're moving into the late 70s. We've come to the conclusion that the flatheads and the 6-cylinders aren't fast enough anymore. We moved up into the overhead V8 motors, and everybody was running the small block Chevys. for the most part. There was one guy out there, we talked about Jim Wyman, still running the Ford engines back in those days, and a couple guys running the Chrysler engines. But moving into the coupes, they actually evolved into almost a super modified type car back in the days. And I can remember a car, Bill and Glenn were talking about Hudson's. Bill actually came out with a Hudson coupe one year powered by Chevy. Is that right, Bill? Remember the Hudson coupe?
No, it was a Willys.
Willys coupe. Okay, that was a Willys coupe.
33 Willys
That's right.
coupe.
Yeah, that was a pretty sleek looking little piece.
It was a fine car, except the frame wasn't very good. I'll tell you what, me and Al Hayden went down there in the Platte River and dug that out of the river. It was in there for to keep the river in the river, but we dug that out one night at midnight, and we put it together, and it's supposed to be down in Gretna right now. A man trying to get it put back together. He said nothing fits. Well, when Al Hayden got done with something, nothing fit. That's correct. The doors didn't fit, the trunks didn't fit, and the first night out with that car, I won both features. It did go, but the frame got weak, and then it went to pot.
They could have said Al Hayden was the Smokey eunuch of Omaha racing scene. He could probably bend the rules as good as anybody, especially when they were his own rules. If he owned the track, he could probably do whatever.
I've got a question for Bill Rick. Bill, is there a track that you did not win a championship at? Is there a track you did not win a championship at? Besides Shelby County, Corning, Harlan, I said that, Sunset, Arlington?
I didn't at Corning. Well, I didn't win at Corning. I never run there that much. But you kind of want to rephrase that. As far as the championship, was there a track I didn't get thrown out of? there wasn't a one.
Okay. Is there a track you didn't get thrown out of then?
August was a bad month. The balloon got too big and it broke.
The heat of the summer, right?
Yeah. Everything went fine in May, June, and July, but August was tough.
Well, we talk about we're getting up into those middle 80s, near the end of middle 60s, near the end of the 60s. The coupe days maybe were numbered. That's when they first moved into that late model division out there. And when we first started the late models, I know you talk about Jim Wyman had a Ford Fairlane. You came out with a beautiful '66 Chevelle that year and took the. I believe Jim Wyman won the first points championship, but in 1969, you won your second points championship out there. This one being in the late model division. That was the first year of late models only.
Yes, and that was a mighty fine little automobile, because I'll never forget that. I went and got that car from Ryan Auto Parts. It had been rolled over. The roof was caved in, and Al Hayden said, well, I can fix that. So he took the seats out, and he kicked it out with his feet. And all I done was got some junkyard springs underneath there, and that 327 motor, I give $800 for that car. And I was really amazed how it would go around that racetrack at Sunset. And my old buddy Bob there, he had a large 427 in there, but he was no problem. But Buddy Bud there, Bud Burdick was no problem. He had his 427s in there. But that car would come off with number 2 like Jack the Bear.
Well, Jim Wyman had the 289 at first, then he went to the 351. You
right,
bet.
Right.
But I remember that car, and then that car was replaced by I think a '69 Chevelle later on. There's an old video floating around, and it's got I believe that was the final year that they raced both divisions of cars on there, and I think you picked up in that video. You picked up the checkered flag in the late model division. There's some great footage of that old '67 Chevelle floating around. I don't know if you saw that.
68, I think, Stan.
Huh?
That was the last year on the
68, the last year for both divisions.
Well, that was mighty fine racing them days. You could scratch the paint a little bit more there, but you couldn't bring the bumpers back because they went back in the tires. And the old coupe days, you had the little bumper in between the frames. The first thing you hit was the wheel. But back there, you could, in them late models, the full-bodied late model, you could scratch you a little bit harder.
You talk about getting up into the late model division. Of course, you guys moved up. Bob Kaziski moved up. I think the first year he actually drove a '60 Ford that was owned by somebody else. The following year he came out with that '67 Chevelle. Had the big block in it. Had an accident. Keith Lightoff drove the car. Keith was up here, drove the car for part of that year. guys getting everybody moving into that late model division, and pretty soon everybody pretty much forgot about the coupes out at Sunset.
You talk about something scary. That's when Bob went off the east-south end with that 68 or 9 Chevelle, which they had. That probably is the biggest scare I ever had, because I happened to be on the track that time, and he passed me, and I couldn't figure out what went wrong. But boy, he went off. Wow.
What happened?
Had the gas pedal stick open going into turn 3, and that was
it. So was there? I mean, tell me about that back area there. Was there no guardrail, no fence, no?
Back in those days,
yeah.
but actually there was a guardrail back down there at that time, but went right through it.
Oh, jeez.
No, well, he went off the south end out in the pits.
Yeah.
There was a guardrail back there then.
Stan, were you there the night when Roger Hayden? I missed that night when Roger Hayden's car got cut right in half.
Yeah, hit the edge of the billboards. That'll be coming up probably in segment 2. We'll be talking about the later
That was
years
a late
little
model
bit.
then? Okay.
That was a tube frame late model, yeah, and that car pretty much was cut right in half, right at the firewall there. But those years coming up later on. Back in the early days, we talk about Bob Parker picking up a couple track championships, Bill Rick with 2 track championships over the years. Bud Burdick picked up 4 back in the coupe days. Then he came back. Bill Rick won it in '69. Bud came back and beat you in '70 with Wayne Mason's car. You guys had some pretty good battles between the blue and yellow.
Very good. And they were really good races, too.
Yep. Jim Wyman in his days, he picked up 3 track championships back in the coupes, and he picked up the first late model track championship. That's when he had the Fairlane, I believe, that first year. But that kind of got us up into the middle years of Sunset Speedway, and a lot of great racing. And we talked about a lot of names, bring back a lot of memories back in the day.
Well, Stan, you want to move on to turn number 4 and start asking some questions?
Let's take the last corner, and we got a lot of guys out. Everybody that was up here a little bit earlier, anybody that's up here or anybody out there in the crowd, we'll have somebody out there with a microphone. And if you got any questions you want to ask anybody about what was happening back in those days, we'll move on to turn 4.
All right, we'll be right back here on the front stretch, presented by Joe's Karting in Council Bluffs. This is AM 590, Omaha's ESPN Radio. Heading into turn number 4, just about ready to wrap up the early years at Sunset Speedway here on the front stretch, presented by Joe's Karting. And thank you very much to Quaker Steak and Lube, to Kaziski Auto Parts, to Stan Caesar, Wayne Q, Lee Ackerman, all these guys who were so gracious to help us out with putting this all together. We do appreciate everything that everyone has done. And Stan, thank you so much for helping me out with this. I duly appreciate it. This is the question and answer segment, so I think we have, is this Maggie again? No, this is not Maggie.
This is Carly Stokes, and I'm Lisa Stokes. I'm the one who started the I Miss Sunset Speedway Facebook page.
Oh, okay, so thank you very much. By the way, that's a Facebook page. Check it out. I am a member. I've been getting posts all week long from, are you banning Wayne Q again? Because he's at his limit for posts, isn't he?
Oh, no. I'm banning Luke Cochran, if he doesn't stop posting for his roofing company. And
Luke. The outlaw's in trouble again.
I'm the marshal of the page as well.
All right, what was your daughter's name?
This is my daughter, Carly Stokes.
Glenn is my favorite driver, and he's been racing since 1949.
Did you have a question for Glenn?
When did he stop racing?
When did he stop racing?
Glenn Roby, when did you stop racing? When was your final lap?
Maybe about 2.5 years ago or something close to that. I think the last race I run was maybe up at Blackbird Speedway, but I'm really not.
Blackbird Bend.
Really not
talk about, I mean, isn't that pretty amazing? A guy that started racing in the 40s, raced throughout the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000, into 2000, and in the teens, over 7 decades. Jeez. I think that deserves a round of applause. Glenn Roby, 7 decades.
Yeah, but the whole trouble was I was still trying to win a race.
He was still trying to win that first points championship.
I think we've got one more question for our panel.
What was the biggest wreck Glenn has ever been in?
Glenn, what was your biggest wreck?
I think the hardest one I took was up at Park Jefferson. We was both running at top speed, and a car come out of the grass with water on his tires and hit the car next to me, turned him into me, and I flew off the racetrack and got into some big poles that was supporting a observation deck on the inside, and it just cut everything off of that car.
Wow.
From one end to the other, and they couldn't get it in my trailer, and so my son was up there, and he had an open trailer, so they loaded up my junk on the open trailer and put his modified in the box. And when my son Steve got off from the fire department, he come up there and he said he looked at that car on the trailer and didn't recognize it, that it was a late model. He said, "Is Kurt all right?" And no, that ain't Kurt's car. That's the old man.
Did you take any injuries during that accident?
No, I honest to God, it never hurt me at all except my feelings. But
hurt the wallet a little bit too.
It completely destroyed that Barry Wright car. There was it was junk.
Wow,
Yeah.
wow. It still does amaze me how some of you guys can get in some of the worst accidents. And the safety equipment, when did that happen?
Oh, I can't remember exactly what year that was, but I do know that it was probably back in the mid '90s, I would say, maybe early 2000s. I think it was a '98 car, so it could have been early 2000s, but it was a car that Butch Lavelle helped me with the financial end of it, and from Lakeside Auto Parts, and then I had to get a whole nother car.
It does amaze me though. I mean, but were the safety equipment at that time pretty good? I mean, well, I guess good enough for you to walk away without a scratch.
I'll tell you the truth. The only time I ever really got a little bit hurt at all, of all things, I was at Eagle Raceway, and they got a deal there where water runs down across the track where the cars come off, and I had two softest springs and shocks on the front of the thing, and the front bumper dug in, and was doing, maybe 70 miles an hour plus or something, and that car stopped. And first time in my life I was 6 foot tall. My head about got broke off.
All right. Anybody else have any questions for our legends? Come on up. We'll be glad to answer them for you. Go ahead and let's continue on, Stan. We'll keep going as people build their questions up. Young lady, you got a question? No?
Moving into the 1970s, we already talked about the coupes were out by then. They were into late models. Late models were the main division that was racing out there. And the track was sold, made slightly larger, and was sold in the off-season. Al Hayden sold the track to two Council Bluffs, Iowa businessmen, Lyle Klein and Galen Brotherson. And I know Lyle's sons are in attendance tonight. We talked about a little bit of that. I think that deal transpired in a bar somewhere down in Daytona Beach, Florida. But somehow, no, that was a little bit later on. That deal transpired. That was when the Kellys purchased the track from Lyle and Galen. But those guys came in, and that was the first year they started racing a second class. They had kind of a support class. They were involved with the old Bronco class over at Playland Speedway in Council Bluffs, and they brought some of the street stock type late models that were right underneath the modified late models. So they had two classes of cars over there in those middle years during the Klein and Brotherson era.
His skin, you was had him under the arms, pulling out, and I grabbed back.
Any questions you guys have for our guys? Don't be shy. Come on up. Ask a question or two if you have a question you'd like to know from these guys. Maybe it's about their families. Any questions you guys have at all?
I got one.
Oh, Buddy Ray's got a question.
This one's actually for Stan. Stan, we have these Hall of Famers right here, these legends. These guys paved the way for guys like myself to go racing and do what we do today. Now, you've been around and you've seen some of these guys drive, and you're watching guys like myself drive nowadays. We hear about these accidents, and you look at the cars that were then compared to the cars that were now. How tough as nails are these drivers here sitting to the right of you?
It was pretty amazing. I'll tell you what, if you looked at those cars that they raced back in those days, I bet that probably out of these three guys sitting here, I don't think any of them would probably get in one of those cars today. If you actually looked at what they were racing in back in those days back there, but
you still do.
well, Bill, yeah, but you know something? That car is pretty well. It's a lot different than the old car, right, Bill?
It's built pretty nice. It's different than the old well pipe.
Yeah.
Turkey weld. No, this is built pretty decent.
Yeah.
Oh.
And talk about the old days.
That is a Playland.
We heard about Glenn Roby used to tie him back before seat belts. He used to tie himself into the seat with a piece of rope.
Really?
Can you believe that?
What? What did you say?
You used to tie yourself into the car with a piece of rope before seat belts?
No, not exactly.
Not exactly.
Okay, can I?
You got some splaining to do, Lucy.
Can I mention another track?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We're just telling stories. Go ahead.
Okay, if we're just telling stories, all right. We was over at Playland Park, and back in the day, none of us had fabricating stuff to make good roll bars or good seats or nothing. And so I went over and I bought an old aircraft seat out of a World War II fighter plane. And I thought, okay, this is nice. He's got a place for the seat belt hooked up and everything. And so I'm over at Playland Park, and they had a big fence in the backstretch. And somebody got into me a little bit, and I know what a board fence is. It's not real nice coming through the front window. And so I tried to keep the front end from getting into the fence. The back wheel hit it. It stopped. My rump kept going and knocked the side of the seat out. And so there went the seat belt. And so we got back in the pit, and my brother Vern, he went out to his car and got about 50 feet of rope and wrapped that around me.
Just wrapped you in.
I didn't even have a knife. I couldn't have got out of there. Hey, that's the way it was.
Tom Gutowski, would that kind of thing work nowadays?
Is that IMCA legal? He can't hear us back there in the back.
Well, there was no numbers on the rope.
Well, the three guys, we got the legends back up here talking again. One more thing, you guys have all raced back from the coupes, progressed all the way up into the late models, and a lot of great guys you raced against over the years. Give us your toughest competitor in the coupes, and give us your toughest competitor back in the late models. I'm talking about from 1957 going forward, all the way up into the late models. And we'll start with Bob down there in the end. Bob, who do you think the toughest guy was out there?
Well, I really don't know. That they were all tough, but probably the two tough ones were right here sitting beside me, along with Jim Wyman and Keith Lightoff, and they were just great drivers. They give you competition all the way.
And Glenn?
And
Okay.
Bud Burdick was in there too.
Yeah.
It's really hard to say any one, because there really was several. Bobby Parker, he was always in there, and the guy sitting next to me, he was very hard to beat. Bud Burdick was really bad, and my neighbor that parked to me next to the fence, he was very good, and there was just on and on. So it's really hard to say, because anybody that went out each and every week, you had to beat whoever.
Well, you can go back and look at some of those point standings back in those early days. It seemed like there were more winners. Nobody dominated. Everybody got a couple. Jim got 3 in a row at one time, and until Bob came along, Bob, I think, won 5 out of 6, but that was after the transition, a couple years in the coupes, and then moving into the late models. I think back in the coupe days when everybody was building their own stuff, and it seemed like there was a lot more competition and a lot less domination back in those
Can I
days.
say one more thing?
Sure, you bet.
Okay, when that transition came going into late models, I really was behind times all through them early years of late models, and I didn't do real well when they switched over to coil spring front.
Well,
cars.
When they first went from the coupes to the late models, you were actually a holdout. You moved to super modifieds for a couple of years, didn't you?
I tried that for just a little bit. My wife told me that thing's got to go.
It's got to go. Okay.
But yeah, because there was too many people getting hurt because there was no wing on them back in them days. But on the late models until I made a trip down to South Carolina and joined up with Barry Wright down there. I guess I just didn't understand the front end geometry good enough to be a good competitor, and so I needed some outside help. And after I did that, well, then I did a little bit better.
Well, I know Bob down there on the end. You talked about the late models. Bob actually raced the late models with the original IMCA circuit and competed against the likes of Ernie Durr and Ramo Stott and Dick Hutcherson. And you guys got involved with Holman and Moody along with Roy Burdick and Bob Burdick back in those days. So you had a little heads up on the late models probably when they got into that division, didn't you?
Yeah, that kind of helped quite a bit because we knew pretty much what to do from there, and that helped us a little bit.
And then this guy sitting right next to us here, he had kind of an unfair advantage too. He knew this guy up in Harlan, Iowa by the name of Dale Swanson, and I think you guys put some cars together, and he's pretty legendary in his involvement with Chevrolet and their late model racing efforts. Bill, talk just a little bit about your involvement with Dale and how that helped you make the transition into the late models from back in the coupe days.
Well, Dale was very sharp, and I got along with him very good. But when you get back here, who was one of the finer late model drivers? Old Bob Kazicki was tough.
Yeah, that goes without saying, you know.
Jim Wine was too. Bud Burdick was there, but Bud was getting over the hill. But you take Bob, he run her tough. And Jim Wyman come down there at the early years there. But they were still good racers. And then when you go to Dale Swanson, he just had a real knack on a race car. And then I forgot one thing. When he was in the coupes, now Bud Burdick V8 was on top. And I could stay with him sometimes, but okay, they'll get back to the Dale Swanson. Now there was a fine competitor. He wrote a book for General Motors, and Dale Jr.'s got the book yet of how to build a late model race car.
Well, I'll tell you what.
With every number, the spring, the numbers, the motor, the numbers, there was quite a book.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, over the years, you guys provided a lot of great competition for all the fans out at Sunset Speedway, and it's an honor to be sitting up here with you and picking your brain just a little bit, talking about the old days and having some fun here. Okay, let's see.
I got a question.
Okay.
If you don't mind. Gentlemen, if you could, I'll go down the line. What is your favorite memory? Doesn't have to be a win, but what is your favorite memory at Sunset Speedway? There's a few of them. I know you guys have got some stories. Can you pick one?
Who are we talking to?
Go ahead. Whoever's
Let's
first.
start with Bill, and let's move right on down the line. Bill, what's your favorite memory at Sunset Speedway?
Well, I had 2 or 3 of them.
Go ahead and share them all if you want to. We got time.
All right. I'll start out with the first one.
All right.
Me and Bobby Ellison started dead last in the feature. And I got up to him, and I passed him. But I didn't win the race. El Drudo won the race, but me and him started dead last, and we got up to second and third. And that was probably one honor that I'll never forget, right down the front straightaway passing Bobby Ellison. And the next one comes along there. Well, you know, I didn't quite make it. But it's kind of, I got to bring myself to thinking about it. But it was July 2nd of 1989. Well, I had a cardiac arrest, and I'm lucky to be here.
I'll tell you what, I was there that night. I remember when that happened. You were in great hands out in the infield. I'll tell you what, if something like that had to happen, Bill, you know, it couldn't have happened at a better place because you had some great care, and they got you taken care of. And it wasn't too long after that, you was back behind the wheel.
Yeah, no, he didn't. Yeah, I felt very good after it was over with. But I got to compliment Speedy. Speedy's the one that got me started in. He put the starter on me, and he gave me one more shot, and I come around it. And Speedy was real deal.
You know how it is sometimes when you spin out and they got that yellow, they're ready to throw that yellow flag, and you keep cranking that thing, and they give it that last shot, you know, and it finally turns back over. That's what happened.
Yeah, that is right.
Glenn, how about your favorite memory? One more thing. You touched about the Bobby Allison night, and Craig might talk about this a little bit later on, but I can remember Al Drusdo was driving Larry Kelly's car that night, and when Bobby Allison came to town, he got in that car. Al Drusdo hopped in Keith Mander's car, and that was in Keith Mander's car that he won the feature that night and beat the car that he was racing every week that Bobby Allison was driving that night. Yep, I remember that. Glenn, your favorite memory?
Of Sunset?
Yeah.
Well, it's got to be the first two features when this place started. What else can I toot my horn about? I guess. Other than that, well, you know, I guess that was probably the best two deals. That I was always somewhere up in the point standing, but.
Is there just any? Doesn't even have to be on the track. It could be in the pits. A funny thing that happened, maybe with some fans interacting. What was there anything that really sticks out in your mind?
Probably the arguments. Yeah, because you know
that didn't come till later on, though, right?
Well, I'm sure that you know that somewhere along the line, you know, everybody steps on somebody's toes, and but no, I had a good time out there, and I always did finish up fairly good in the top 10 and stuff, but so I'm real happy that I had the opportunity to race there in the first race and the last race. The first one I won, the last one I wrecked. So
the joy of victory, the agony of defeat.
Yeah, there you are.
Bob probably got so many he can't remember which one is his favorite, right?
Probably the best memories is all the people you really meet out there, the owners, the track, everybody that was there, and you get to meet them after the races. That was probably the best thing that there was in racing.
The camaraderie and all the people you meet. That's what they say. Racing is not sometimes about the racing, but it's the racing family and all the people that you meet along the way.
By the way, I want to take a moment. Bob, didn't you just get inducted into another Hall of Fame?
Yeah, I just got inducted into the National Dirt Track Hall of Fame down in Florence, Kentucky.
Well, congratulations.
And if we got just enough time, one thing that we didn't touch on, you know, when I grew up at Sunset Speedway, some of the different announcers that were at Sunset Speedway over the years that I had the opportunity to listen to, and kind of sometimes, through osmosis, you pick up certain things. But I remember Joe Patrick being one of the first announcers out at Sunset Speedway. They had a lot of radio disc jockeys from one time or another, Joe Ray, Buddy McCall. They had a lot of TV folks out there. Mike May was an announcer out there for quite a number of years. He was a broadcaster on KETV. Lee Barron, who basically, he was a journeyman announcer. He had announced at Playland Speedway. He announced for quite a number of years with Joey Chitwood's Auto Thrill show. And then along came this guy by the name of George Murphy. And unfortunately, we lost George last year. But George was one of the greatest guys out there, and one of the most entertaining announcers, I think, that was ever out at Sunset Speedway. And he'll be sorely missed, I know. But he was a great influence. And then then later on, you'll be hearing from Tom Grasso a little bit later on. There were quite a number of guys. I had the opportunity to join Tom back in '92, and we took it all the way to that final checkered flag.
Well, let me ask you. I think it would be a little bit, we'd be neglecting a big part of Sunset Speedway if I didn't ask you. Can you tell us a favorite memory of yours, Stan?
Oh gosh, that would be pretty tough. Let's see. I think one of my favorite memories might have came just a little bit later on. Back in those days when NASCAR became affiliated with the racetrack out there, and things were hot and heavy for the National Points Championship coming down to the final night. And being from South Omaha, I was pretty good friends with the Kaziski family. My dad knew Bob and the whole family for years, and we kind of grew up together. And I helped Joe a little bit a couple of years. And when Joe picked up that first national championship, Steve just missed the year before, and then Joe picked up the national on that final night by getting a feature win that year. I think that was probably one of the most favorite memories, and seeing some of the guys that when they picked up their first feature win. Howard Koziel comes to mind. Scott Koskovich, how excited they were and how emotional they were after they took that first checkered flag for the first time at Sunset Speedway.
All right. Fans, we don't want to miss out on you. Anybody got any questions for these guys before we take a break? Any questions at all? They'd be glad to field them.
Glenn's got one more thing to add if you get a chance.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, yeah, come on up, sir. Go ahead and give your name.
George Bush. Glenn Roby, I just want to know, I've been over your garage before, eating that fine chicken at the Alpine Inn. How many Hudson parts do you still have in the garage?
Zero.
About zero. I just got pictures.
Just pictures and memories now, huh?
Isn't that great when you got pictures and memories, Glenn? That's something they can never take away from us, right?
But I do have one Hudson. Can I say this?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I got one Hudson that I campaigned around, and I know these guys remember running against it. And Bill Smith at Speedway Motors found it out at McCook, Nebraska.
That's not the one that looks like Swiss cheese, is it?
Yeah, and and he put it into his museum down there, and the guy was telling a story about the doggone thing, and he said, well, he drilled all these 4-inch holes in this thing to let the air out and make it let it go through the air a little faster. And after he got done talking about it, well, my son Steve and I was in the crowd, and he says, anybody got any questions or answers or you want to talk about? And so I said, well, you did a real good job of telling the history of that car and everything, but I want to correct you on one thing. When back in the day, when I drilled all them holes in that car, and it was a 1934 Hudson Coupe, I said, it wasn't to make it lighter. It wasn't to let the air go out. I says, as you look at, my number is number 8, so it's a holy 8. And that was the whole thing about that.
Yeah. Any more questions for our guys before we wrap up this final hour?
What? Oh. Okay. A round of applause for all the Hall of Fame legends that we've got up here, huh?
All right, folks, make sure that if you missed any part of this, you head over to our YouTube page. We're posting the video of it, so you can see exactly what we all look like and the fun we're having tonight and exactly how packed this place got because of everyone's love for Sunset Speedway. I want to say thank you to all the legends for coming out tonight and talking with us about their experiences. I want to say thank you again to Lee Ackerman, Kaziski Auto Parts, Quaker Steak and Lube, Joe's Karting, and everybody that made the show possible. Join us next weekend as we will begin hour number 2, the later years. Thank you for joining us. This has been The Front Stretch on AM 590, Omaha's ESPN Radio.